The heavy iron gates of the Conca did not merely close. They slammed shut with the deafening, final screech of a tomb being sealed. As Orhan Sahib rode into the main courtyard, leading the horse that carried the Shahzadi Sporcha, he felt the shift in the air before he even dismounted. The atmosphere inside the fortress had mutated. It was no longer the arrogant, bustling center of a Byzantine command preparing for a glorious crusade. It was a cage. The air was thick with the suffocating, metallic scent of fear. Archers lined the parapets. Their arrows knocked and pointed not outward toward the valleys, but inward toward the courtyard itself. The guards standing at the doors of the armory and the command chambers gripped their spears with white-knuckled tension, their eyes darting nervously toward anyone who moved. Orhan Sahib slid from his saddle, his boots hitting the cobblestones. He kept his face perfectly blank, the mask of Clems firmly in place, but beneath the armor his heart began a slow, measured, defensive beat. He reached up and helped Sporcha down from her horse. Her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped his armored forearm. She, too, felt the terror radiating from the stone walls. The coarse Byzantine guard with the scarred cheek, the one who had watched Orhan Sahib butcher the Akritai raiders in the mountain pass, dismounted clumsily. He looked around the courtyard, bewildered by the lockdown. "What is happening?" the guard muttered, his voice cracking. "Why are the inner portcullises lowered?" Before anyone could answer, the doors of the main keep were thrown open, crashing against the stone walls with the violence of a thunderclap. Andronikos strode out into the courtyard. He did not look like a Shahzada. He did not look like a commander on the verge of empire. He looked like a madman. His grand robes were rumpled, his hair unkempt, his eyes sunken into deep, bruised hollows. Behind him walked Damir Khan and Mahmud, both men pale, their hands resting on their sword hilts, looking like prisoners walking to the gallows rather than generals of the vanguard. Andronikos walked down the stone steps, his boots echoing in the absolute breathless silence of the courtyard. He stopped in the center, slowly turning in a circle, his bloodshot eyes sweeping over every soldier, every guard, every stable boy, and finally resting upon Orhan Sahib and Sporcha. "Bring him," Andronikos whispered. The whisper was so quiet, yet it carried across the stones like the hiss of a coiled viper. Two massive executioners emerged from the dark corridors of the keep. Between them, dragging his feet, his face beaten into a swollen, bloody pulp, was Kuladze, the captain of the guard, the man who had stood in the provisioning yard just days ago, smiling, proud of his ledgers, proud of his minor authority, the man who had spoken 2 words too many. Far to the south, Orhan Sahib stood perfectly still. He did not blink. He did not swallow. He locked every muscle in his body, forcing his breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. Beside him, he felt Sporcha stiffen, her sharp mind connecting the pieces, realizing with a sudden, horrifying clarity exactly what had transpired while they were in the mountains, and exactly who was responsible for the madness unfolding before them. Andronikos grabbed Kuladze by the hair, wrenching his bloody face upward so that the captain was forced to look at the assembled soldiers. "Look at him," Andronikos roared, his voice tearing from his throat in a ragged scream. "Look at the face of a worm, a weak, pathetic, loose-tongued worm who drank my wine, took my coin, and then opened his mouth and let the rats crawl in." Kuladze wept, blood bubbling past his broken teeth. "Jahan Pana, please. I did not know, I swear by the cross, I did not know." "You did not know," Andronikos mocked, his voice dropping an octave, dripping with a poisonous, trembling rage. "You did not know that the coordinates of the Pope's armada were a secret. You did not know that when you boast to your little friends about the ships anchoring in the south, you are signing the death warrant of an entire crusade." Damir Khan stepped forward, his voice tight. "Jahan Pana, Kuladze is a fool, but he is not a spy. He does not have the intellect to encode a message to Bursa. He only babbled. Someone else heard him. Someone else listened." Andronikos dropped Kuladze, letting the broken man collapse onto the cobblestones. The Shahzada turned to Damir Khan, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Yes," Andronikos whispered. "Someone listened. The spy is here, standing in this courtyard, breathing my air, smiling at me. And because of him, the Bay of Megara is a graveyard of ash. 15 Ottoman galleys sailed into the dark and burned our salvation to the waterline. The fleet is gone." A shockwave of murmurs rippled through the courtyard. The guards exchanged terrified glances. The fleet was gone. The unbeatable armada, the great Latin hope, was ash. Orhan Sahib heard the words, and deep within the armored fortress of his mind, a profound, silent prayer of gratitude rose to the heavens. Alhamdulillah. The message had reached the Sultan. Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga had struck. The sea was safe. The Ottoman heartland was secure from the waves. His sacrifice, his terrifying days of deception, had not been in vain. But the cost of that victory was currently bleeding on the cobblestones. Andronikos drew his sword. The steel scraped against the scabbard, a sound that made every man in the courtyard flinch. "Who did you tell, Kuleds?" the Shahzada asked, stepping over the weeping captain. "Give me a name. Give me the name of the man who asked about the ships. Give me the rat and I will let you die quickly." Orhan Sahib's eyes remained fixed on the wall behind Andronikos. He prepared himself. If Kuleds pointed at Clems, there would be no trial. There would be no interrogation. Orhan Sahib would have to draw his sword, take a sportia, and try to carve a path through 50 archers and 100 guards. It was a suicide run. He shifted his weight ever so slightly to the balls of his feet. His right hand hovered a fraction of an inch from his hilt. Kuleds coughed up a mouthful of blood and looked around the courtyard through swollen, half-closed eyes. He looked at the armorers. He looked at the sentries. His gaze swept over Orhan Sahib. Orhan Sahib did not look away. He met the dying man's eyes with a cold, absolute emptiness. I do not know," Kuled sobbed, his voice breaking. "I spoke to many. I complained about the provisions to the quartermaster, to the lieutenants, to anyone who would listen. I do not know who the spy is. There were so many." Andronikos stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a scream of pure, unfiltered frustration, he drove his sword straight down through Kuled's back, pinning the man to the cobblestones. Kuleds gasped once, a wet, rattling sound, and then his body went entirely limp. Orhan Sahib watched the man die. He watched the blood pool out over the stones, creeping toward his own boots. A cold, heavy stone settled into the bottom of Orhan Sahib's stomach. This was the true nature of espionage. This was the rot that ate at the soul of the spy. He had not killed Kuleds with his own hands, but he had guided the blade just as surely as if he held the hilt. Kuleds had been a fool, an enemy soldier, but he had not deserved to be butchered like a dog for answering a question he thought was innocent. "This is the cost," Orhan Sahib told himself, locking the guilt away in an iron box in the deepest vault of his mind. "This is the price of Bursa. This is the price of the empire. I will carry this sin so that my people do not have to carry chains." Andronikos ripped his sword from the corpse and pointed the dripping blade at the gathered soldiers. "No one leaves," he roared, his voice cracking. "No one sleeps. I will interrogate every officer, every guard, every servant. We will tear this fortress down to the bedrock until I find the man who sold the sea to Sultan Orhan." The courtyard erupted into chaos as the commanders began barking orders, seizing officers, dragging men toward the dungeons. In the midst of the madness, Orhan Sahib felt a hand grip his arm. It was a sportia. Her fingers were digging into his armor with desperate strength. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, entirely stripped of their royal arrogance. She saw the truth. She knew with absolute certainty that the man standing beside her had burned the Pope's armada. She knew that he was the reason Andronikos was tearing his own command apart. "Come," Orhan Sahib muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the shouting. "We must get you to your quarters." He led her through the chaos, walking with the measured, unhurried pace of a loyal soldier doing his duty. He did not run. Running was for prey. He was not prey. He was the wolf walking among the sheep, disguised in their wool, his teeth still dripping with their blood. While the Conca descended into a paranoid nightmare of torture and suspicion, the reality of the war shifted entirely to the land. The sea was lost to the Byzantines, which meant the survival of Andronikos's crusade now depended entirely on crushing the Ottoman forces in the valleys before Sultan Orhan could bring the main army from Bursa. Far to the north, where the mountains flattened out into a vast, sweeping gorge known as the Valley of Scars, the earth began to vibrate. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, a vibration that started in the soles of the boots and traveled up into the teeth. It was the sound of Daimir Khan's vanguard, 10,000 men, heavy infantry, armored cavalry, and lines of archers stretching back as far as the eye could see, marching in perfect, terrifying unison. The Byzantine banners snapped in the freezing wind, displaying the crosses and the eagles of an empire desperate to reclaim its lost glory. Standing at the narrowest point of the valley pass, blocking the road to the Ottoman heartland, was the Ottoman vanguard. They were outnumbered 3-1. They had no heavy siege engines. They had no fortress walls to hide behind. They had only their shields, their swords, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that if they broke, the empire broke with them. Orhan Analiz sat atop his black warhorse at the center of the line. The bandages beneath his armor were pulled tight, the whip marks on his back burning with every breath he took, but his posture was flawless. He held his lance high, the Ottoman pennant fluttering at the tip. Beside him rode Evrenos, his massive battle-axe resting across his saddle, his face set in a grim, joyful anticipation. This was where Evrenos belonged. Not in the shadows of intrigue, not in the quiet of a camp, but here, in the deafening roar of impending slaughter, where the only truth that mattered was the weight of the steel in your hands. Fatima sat on her horse to Orhan's left, her bow already strung, a quiver of heavy, armor-piercing arrows resting against her thigh. She looked at the approaching Byzantine tide, the sea of iron and spears rolling toward them, and she did not feel fear. She felt only a cold, sharp focus. She glanced at Orhan, looking at the man she loved, the man she had pulled from the fire, and she silently swore to the heavens that no Byzantine blade would touch him today so long as she drew breath. And on the right flank, standing on foot ahead of the shield wall, was Jarkata Sahib. He did not want a horse. A horse separated a man from the earth, and Jarkata Sahib needed to feel the earth today. He needed to feel the blood of the enemy soaking into the soil. He held his twin blades loose by his sides. He watched the approaching army, and he did not see 10,000 men. He saw 10,000 deaths. He saw the faces of the men who had paid the traitor Mustafa. He saw the empire that had taken Boran. The Byzantine army halted 500 yards away. The marching ceased, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the gorge. Daimir Khan, riding a white stallion, advanced to the front of his lines. He looked at the small Ottoman force blocking the pass, and he drew his sword, pointing it toward the sky. Archers, Daimir Khan's command echoed across the valley. Thousands of Byzantine longbows were raised in unison, the creak of the bending wood sounding like a forest being torn apart. Shields, Orhan Analiz roared, his voice cutting through the wind like a thunderclap. The Ottoman infantry stepped forward, their heavy wooden and iron shields locking together in a seamless, impenetrable wall. Evrenos raised his own massive shield, moving his horse to cover Fatima's flank. Jarkata Sahib did not raise a shield. He simply crouched low, his blades angled, his eyes tracking the sky. The sky went dark. A cloud of black arrows, thousands of them, blotted out the sun as they arched over the valley and rained down upon the Ottoman lines. The sound of the impact was deafening, a continuous, horrific drumming of iron tearing into wood, glancing off steel helmets, and occasionally finding the soft flesh beneath the armor. Men grunted, holding the line, their boots sliding backward in the mud from the sheer kinetic force of the volley. "Hold!" Orhan Analiz shouted over the din, an arrow glancing off his pauldron. "Do not break the wall." The volley ended, leaving the Ottoman shields bristling with shafts, looking like a forest of deadly thorns. Before the Ottomans could recover, the Byzantine war horns blew a deep, terrifying blast. "Infantry, advance!" Damir Khan bellowed. The front lines of the Byzantine army let out a massive, guttural roar and charged. A tidal wave of armored men, screaming for blood, sprinting across the muddy expanse of the valley, their spears lowered, their swords drawn. Evrenos gripped his battle-axe, a wild, feral grin spreading across his face. He looked at Fatima, who was already drawing her bowstring back to her ear. "For the daughter who will laugh," Evrenos roared, his voice carrying the sheer, beautiful madness of a man who loved the fight as much as he loved the peace. "And for the son who will hold the sword." Fatima released her string. The heavy arrow tore across the distance and punched straight through the throat of a charging Byzantine captain. "For Boran," she shouted, drawing another arrow with blinding speed. "For the martyrs." The Byzantine wave crashed into the Ottoman shield wall. The impact shook the valley. It was a horrific, grinding collision of wood, steel, and bone. The Ottoman line buckled under the sheer weight of the numbers, the front ranks crushed together, men fighting shoulder to shoulder, unable to swing their swords, forced to use daggers, teeth, and raw, desperate strength to hold the pass. Evrenos spurred his horse forward, plunging directly into the thickest part of the Byzantine charge. He swung his massive battle-axe in a devastating arc, cleaving through shields and armor as if they were made of parchment. He was a force of nature, a mountain of muscle and rage, roaring his defiance into the faces of men who realized too late that they had charged into the path of a giant. Burhan Faladios fought with the precision of a master tactician, his lance striking with lethal accuracy, commanding the line, shifting his reserves to plug the gaps where the shield wall threatened to break. His back screamed in agony with every thrust, the whip marks tearing open, blood soaking the bandages beneath his armor, but he did not stop. He was the commander. If he fell, the vanguard fell. And in the mud, moving beneath the chaos of the cavalry and the crushing weight of the infantry, Jarkata Sahib fought his own private war. He slipped through the breaking lines, a shadow among the slaughter. His twin blades moved so fast they were practically invisible, a blur of silver that left only death in its wake. He did not block. He deflected, pivoted, and struck. He severed hamstrings, opened throats, and drove his blades through the gaps in the Byzantine armor. He was completely surrounded, fighting 10 men at once, but he moved with the fluid, untouchable grace of a ghost. Every strike was a name. Every kill was a prayer. "Blood for blood," Jarkata Sahib whispered, his voice lost in the screams of the dying. "Tooth for tooth." But courage alone cannot stop a tide. The sheer numerical superiority of Damir Khan's forces was beginning to tell. The Ottoman shield wall was cracking, inch by inch, pushed backward up the valley pass. The mud was turning to a slick, red slurry, making it impossible to hold their footing. Damir Khan, watching from the safety of his rear guard, smiled. The Ottomans were brave, but they were breaking. He raised his hand to signal his heavy cavalry to prepare for the final, shattering charge that would wipe Burhan Faladios and his vanguard from the face of the earth. But before Damir Khan could drop his hand, a sound echoed from the far ridge behind the Ottoman lines. It was not a horn, it was not a drum. It was a single, long, piercing cry of an eagle, blown through a hollowed bone whistle. The sound carried over the roar of the battle, cutting through the clash of steel, ringing clear and sharp in the freezing air. Tarhan. Standing on the high ridge overlooking the valley, Tarhan the Shadow lowered the bone whistle from his lips. He sat atop his exhausted horse, looking down at the slaughter in the gorge below. He had ridden without sleep, slipping past the Byzantine patrols, carrying the final message from the heart of the empire. Behind Tarhan, the crest of the ridge began to darken. It was not clouds, it was men. Thousands of them. The main Ottoman army had arrived. Sultan Orhan rode to the crest of the ridge, his golden armor gleaming in the pale sunlight, the great green banner of the Ottoman Empire snapping furiously in the wind above him. Beside him rode Zarkin, Abdul Rahman, and the elite Sipahi cavalry, their lances raised, their horses stamping the earth, eager for the blood below. The Sultan had not waited in Bursa. The moment the fleet had sailed for Megara, he had mobilized the entire remaining strength of the capital, marching day and night through the hidden mountain passes, guided by Killal's maps, arriving at the exact moment the vanguard was preparing to sell their lives for the soil. Sultan Orhan looked down into the valley. He saw Burhan Faladios holding the center. He saw Evrenos carving a path of ruin. He saw Fatima's arrows flying true. He saw Jarkata Sahib dancing with death. And he saw Daimir Khan's massive army, unaware that the hammer was about to fall upon them. The Sultan drew his sword, raising it high above his head. The steel caught the light, a beacon of absolute divine authority. Allahu Akbar! Sultan Orhan's voice boomed, carrying the weight of the throne, the fury of the faithful, and the unstoppable momentum of history. Allahu Akbar! 20,000 Ottoman soldiers roared in response, the sound hitting the valley like a physical shockwave. The Byzantine soldiers at the front lines faltered. They looked up toward the ridge, their blood running cold as they saw the massive Ottoman army pouring over the crest, an avalanche of steel and horseflesh rolling down the hillside directly toward their exposed flank. Daimir Khan's smile vanished. His face went entirely pale. He realized in that single, horrifying moment that he had not trapped the Ottoman vanguard. He had been pinned by them. He had been held in place just long enough for the Sultan's jaw to snap shut around him. "Charge!" Sultan Orhan commanded, dropping his sword forward. The Sipahi cavalry hit the valley floor with the force of a meteor strike. They slammed into the right flank of the Byzantine army, shattering their formations instantly. Lances tore through shields, horses trampled infantry into the mud, and the Ottoman swordsmen fell upon the disorganized Latins with the ferocious, pent-up rage of men fighting for their very existence. Burhan Faladios, seeing the Sultan's banner, raised his bloody lance. "The Sultan is here," he roared to his exhausted men. "Push them back, drive them to hell." The Ottoman vanguard, revitalized by the arrival of their ruler, surged forward, their shield wall reforming, pushing the buckling Byzantine center. Evrenos laughed, a deep, booming sound that terrified the men fighting him more than his axe, and he drove deeper into the enemy ranks, carving a path toward Daimir Khan. The Battle of the Valley of Scars had turned from a desperate defense into an absolute rout. The Byzantine army was collapsing, breaking apart under the dual pressure of the vanguard and the Sultan's main force. But while the valley was painted in the blood of open war, the Kanka remained a prison of suffocating paranoia and silent terror. Far to the south, behind the heavy iron gates, Orhan Sahib walked Asporcha to her quarters. The corridors were swarming with guards, doors were being kicked open, officers were being dragged out of their rooms, shouting their innocence, as Andronikos's inquisitors began their grim work. The smell of fear was entirely overwhelming. Orhan Sahib pushed open the heavy oak door of Asporcha's chamber and ushered her inside. He stepped in behind her and closed the door, throwing the iron bolt into place, sealing them off from the madness outside. The room was quiet, lit only by a single candle on the writing desk. Asporcha turned to face him. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear, sharp, burning with the intelligence of a woman who had been raised in the courts of emperors. "You burned the ships," she whispered, her voice trembling, afraid that even the stone walls were listening. Orhan Sahib did not deny it. He took off his Byzantine helmet and set it on the table. He looked at her, his face exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes revealing the toll of the endless, grinding deception he lived every second of his life. "I did what was necessary," he said softly. "If those ships had landed, my people would have been slaughtered. my empire would have been erased. Asportia stepped closer to him. She reached up and placed her hands against the cold steel of his breastplate. Kuleds died because of you, she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of the terrible reality they inhabited. Orhan Sahib closed his eyes for a moment, the image of the captain bleeding on the cobblestones flashing in his mind. Kuleds died because Andronikos is a tyrant, Orhan replied, his voice heavy with the burden of his sins. But yes, I asked the question, I took the answer, and I sent the message. Asportia's hand slid up to his face, her warm fingers resting against his stubble-covered cheeks. You are walking in a graveyard, Orhan, she whispered, tears finally breaking free and tracking down her face. Andronikos will not stop. He is mad. He will torture every man in this fortress until someone gives him a name. And if he finds you, if he discovers that Clems is the spy, he will not just kill you. He will tear you apart piece by piece, and he will make me watch. I know, Orhan Sahib said, opening his eyes, meeting her terrified gaze with an absolute, unshakable calm. Then we must run, Asportia pleaded, her voice cracking. We must find horses. We must slip over the walls tonight. We cannot, he replied gently, pulling her hands from his face and holding them tightly in his own. If Clems disappears tonight, Andronikos will know immediately who the spy was. He will lock down the entire province. We would be hunted down before we cross the first river. But more importantly, my mission here is not finished. Asportia looked at him in disbelief. Not finished. You destroyed his fleet. What more is there? Orhan Sahib looked toward the locked door, listening to the muffled screams echoing from the dungeons below. Shahin Shah, he said quietly, as long as your father is a prisoner in this fortress, Andronikos holds the key to the Byzantine throne. Sultan Orhan needs the Shahin Shah alive, and I need to find a way to get him out. You are going to die here, Asportia sobbed, resting her forehead against his chest. You are going to die for a war that will never end. Orhan Sahib wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly in the dim candlelight of the locked room. We all die, my sultana, he whispered into her hair. The only choice we have is what we die for. I will not leave you. I will not leave your father. I will wear this mask until the flesh rots from my bones, if that is what it takes to break this fortress from the inside. He held her as she wept, two enemies bound by destiny, trapped in the belly of a paranoid beast, listening to the sounds of a witch hunt that was inching closer to their door with every passing hour. Andronikos was packing the floor of his command chamber, his hands covered in the blood of his own officers, his mind spinning into the dark abyss of absolute madness. He was interrogating men himself now, convinced that everyone was lying, convinced that the spy was laughing at him from the shadows. Who? Andronikos muttered to himself, his eyes darting frantically across the empty room. Who has the access? Who has the intellect? Who walks among us without being seen? His gaze fell upon the duty roster lying on the table. The parchment was stained with ink and blood. He scanned the names of the guards, the captains, the quartermasters, looking for anomalies, looking for the ghost. His finger traced down the list. It stopped on a name. Clems. Andronikos stared at the name. Clems, the quiet soldier, the man who had been given the task of guarding the Shahzadi, the man who had been commended for butchering the Akratai raiders in the pass, the man who was always present, always obedient, always listening. The Shahzada slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes widening as the pieces began to align in his fevered mind. Clems, Andronikos whispered, the name tasting like ash and iron. The door to the chamber was thrown open. A bloodied interrogator stepped inside, bowing deeply. Jahanpana, the interrogator, rasped. The quartermaster, before he died on the rack, he confessed something. He said Captain Kuleds was asking unusual questions about the provisions, and that earlier that day, Kuleds had been speaking to one of the personal guards, a man named Clems. Andronikos did not scream. He did not throw a tantrum. The manic energy suddenly drained from his body, replaced by a cold, absolute, horrifying stillness. He looked at the interrogator. "Bring him to me," Andronikos commanded, his voice dead, devoid of all humanity. "Bring Clems to the dungeon, and bring the Shahzadi to watch." The trap was closing, not in the valleys where the blood flowed like rivers, not on the sea where the ships burned to cinders, but here in the cold stone of the Kanka, where the mask was finally cracking, and the true face of the war was about to be revealed in the torturer's light. And that, Nazarene, is where we leave them standing on the precipice. The Sultan's sword has fallen in the Valley of Scars. The blood of empires mixes in the mud. Daimir Khan's vanguard is breaking, but the war is far from decided. In the dark corridors of the Kanka, the most dangerous game of all has reached its terrifying climax. Andronikos has found his ghost. The witch hunt has arrived at Orhan Sahib's door. Will the spy survive the dungeon? Will Asportia be forced to watch her husband bleed? Will Sultan Orhan's victory in the valley be enough to save the men and women trapped behind the iron gates? We are moving into the darkest chapter yet. The lies have run their course. Only truth and steel remain. The order did not travel through the Kanka like a command. It moved through it like poison. Bring Clems to the dungeon. Bring the Shahzadi to watch. The words passed from mouth to mouth, from guard to guard, from corridor to corridor, and with every repetition they grew heavier, darker, more final, until even the torches seemed to burn differently, their flames wavering in the drafts as if they too had understood that something decisive had begun. In the chamber where Asportia stood with her back to the candlelight, and Orhan Sahib stood facing the bolted door, there was no need for either of them to speak the truth aloud. The truth had already entered the room before the boots did. It stood between them like a third presence. The mask had not yet fallen, but the hands of the enemy were already reaching for it. Orhan Sahib turned toward her slowly. Outside, he could hear the gathering of steel, the clipped words of soldiers receiving orders, the rough cough of a man clearing his throat before doing something cruel. Asportia's face had lost all color, but her eyes were alive, burning with the sharp intelligence that had first made her dangerous and then made her beloved. She understood. She understood that the sea had burned because of him. She understood that the fleet of the Pope had become ash because, somewhere in the dark, he had taken a careless phrase from Culad's and turned it into a blade. And she understood, more clearly than ever, that such blades always cut both ways. "Listen to me," Orhan Sahib said, his voice low enough that it barely rose above the hiss of the candle. "No tears, no tenderness, no mercy in your face. If they question you, you hate me. If they strike me, you watch. If they ask you what I am to you, I am nothing but the soldier who dragged you here in chains. Do you understand?" Asportia stepped toward him, anger flaring through her terror. "Nothing," she whispered. "After everything, you still ask me to pretend that you are nothing." "I ask you to keep me alive," he said. She shook her head, and for one dangerous instant the Shahzadi vanished and only the wife remained. "They will kill you anyway." "Perhaps," he said, "but let them kill Clems, not Orhan, not yet, not until I have done what I came here to do." She looked at him with disbelief sharpened by love. "You still speak of your mission, even now." "Especially now." The pounding came at the door then, 3 brutal strikes from the butt of a spear. "Open, in the name of Andronikos." Orhan Sahib took one breath, then another. When he looked at her again, the husband was gone from his face. Clems had returned, the Roman soldier, the obedient hound, the man who bowed to the Shahzada and wore the enemy's colors and buried his true name so deeply that only prayer could reach it. Asportia saw the change happen in front of her eyes, and it hurt her almost as much as any blow could have. She lowered her gaze for a moment, gathering herself, then lifted her chin with the icy, wounded pride of an imperial daughter. By the time Orhan Sahib drew back the bolt, she had become once more the captive princess who despised her captor. The door opened. 4 guards stood there in the torchlight, armored and grim, with the scar-cheeked soldier from the mountain pass among them. He would not meet Orhan Sahib's eyes. He had seen too much on the cliff road. He had seen Clems move like no man he had ever known. Fear had entered him there, and fear was difficult to uproot once planted. By order of the Shahzada, one of the guards said, "Clems, you are to come at once. The Shahzadi comes too." Orhan Sahib gave a single, crisp nod, as commanded. He did not resist when they took his sword. He did not resist when they bound his wrists in iron. He did not resist when they placed themselves on either side of him and prodded him into the corridor with spearpoints held almost politely at his back. He saved his resistance for the only place that mattered, inside, where it could not be seen and therefore could not be broken. They took him downward. The stairs into the dungeon curved through old stone slick with centuries of damp. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness with the maddening patience of time itself. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, and the torches along the walls gave less light than they should have, as if the darkness here had learned to feed on flame. A sportia descended behind him between two guards, and though she made no sound, Orhan Sahib could feel the force of her gaze upon his back. He did not turn. He knew if he turned, Andronikos would already have won something. At the bottom of the stair, the corridor widened into a chamber that had once perhaps been a cellar and had long ago been converted into a place where truth was beaten out of men and replaced with whatever their masters wished to hear. Iron rings had been set into the walls. Chains hung from them. There were tables with leather straps, buckets of water, hooks, tongs, instruments whose purpose needed no explanation. The smell of blood and stale fear was so thick that it seemed to coat the tongue. Andronikos was waiting in the center of the chamber. He had changed since the courtyard. Or rather, the courtyard had been the first crack, and here in the dungeon that crack had widened enough to show what was beneath. His face was composed, but it was the kind of composition that comes after something has shattered and been placed back together by hands that no longer care if the pieces fit properly. His eyes were steady now, almost calm, and that calm was far more dangerous than the fury that had killed Kuleds. Rage blazes and burns out. Cold purpose kills slowly and thinks while killing. Nearby, behind an iron lattice, sat Şahin Şah. The old emperor looked as though some invisible beast had fed upon him day after day and left only the husk. His beard was matted. His clothes hung from him. Yet his eyes, though sunken, still contained that ancient poisonous light of dynastic survival. He had not stopped calculating. Men like Şahin Şah never stopped calculating. Defeat could bend them, captivity could starve them, humiliation could strip them bare, but calculation remained. He watched everyone the way dying embers still watch for wind. When Orhan Sahib was brought into the chamber, Andronikos did not speak immediately. He circled him once slowly, like a buyer inspecting an animal before purchase. He looked at the shackled wrists, the shoulders, the face, the boots still muddy from the mountain pass. Then he stopped in front of him and said so, "Clems." Orhan Sahib bowed his head just enough. "Jahanpana." "You have had an eventful journey," Andronikos said. "Raiders in the mountains. A frightened escort. A safe return despite all obstacles. It seems wherever death rides, you ride faster." "I obey orders well," Orhan Sahib replied. Andronikos smiled faintly, and there was no warmth in it. "Yes, that has been your great talent, obedience, quiet competence, the sort of usefulness that makes a man invisible until the day he is not. Tell me, Clems, why did you ask Kuleds about the southern anchorage?" Orhan Sahib answered at once, not too quickly, not too slowly. "Because soldiers speak, Jahanpana. Ships were being provisioned. Men in the yard were whispering about a great movement at sea. I was escorting the Shahzadi on your most sensitive orders. I wished to know whether the roads behind us would remain open. I wished to judge how long the campaign might last. A soldier who knows the shape of a war prepares better for it." Andronikos tilted his head. "Sensible, useful, almost convincing. But then there is the mountain pass." He stepped closer. "My guards describe something remarkable," he said softly. 12 Akratai raiders, hardened wolves of the border. and one ordinary soldier named Clems who killed them almost before the others had drawn breath. How did a man of so modest a rank acquire such skill? Orhan Sahib met his gaze. On the eastern frontier, Jahanpana, men either learn quickly or they become food for crows. A good answer, Andronikos said, but I find myself weary of good answers. He turned abruptly. Strap him. The guards moved. Orhan Sahib did not struggle. They forced him down onto the table and fastened leather restraints over his wrists and arms. Esportia took a step forward despite herself, and a guard blocked her with a spear haft across her chest. No, she said, the word escaping before she could shape it into hatred. Andronikos turned toward her instantly. No, he asked with dangerous softness. Do you pity him, Shahzadi? This Roman dog, has captivity made your heart tender? Esportia's mind flashed like a drawn blade. She lifted her chin and spat at the stone near Orhan Sahib's boots. I pity any fool who serves you, she said. If you fear your own men this much, then perhaps the Ottoman fire reached more than your ships. The insult landed. A flicker passed over Andronikos's face. Then he smiled again, thinner this time. Your tongue remains sharp. Good, keep it. I may yet need it to identify liars. He gestured to the torturer. The first blow was not with iron or flame. It was with a cane reinforced by metal at the tip, designed not to kill but to carve pain into the nerves with exquisite care. It struck across Orhan Sahib's ribs. The sound cracked through the chamber. Pain shot through his body hot and immediate, but he kept his face composed. The second strike landed lower. The third across the shoulders. He exhaled once through his nose, nothing more. Andronikos watched with his arms behind his back. Who asked you about the anchorage? He said. No one. Another blow. Who do you report to? To you, Jahanpana. A harder strike. Who taught you to fight like that in the past? The enemy, Orhan Sahib said quietly, by trying to kill me often. Andronikos's expression did not change, but the calm in his eyes deepened into something almost scholarly, as though he were now less interested in punishing and more interested in understanding the shape of the man before him. He walked around the table. He observed the discipline, the control of breath, the absence of pleading. He had seen brave men. He had seen stubborn men. He had seen fanatics. What lay before him was not exactly any of these. It was composure sharpened by necessity. And that unsettled him. Bring the Shahzadi closer, he said. The guard forced Esportia forward until she stood within a few feet of the table. She was forced to watch. Andronikos wanted that. He wanted to use her eyes as a second instrument. Look at him, he said to her. Look carefully. When a man lies long enough, eventually his body confesses what his tongue will not. Tell me when you see fear in him. Esportia stared at Orhan Sahib, and for a brief, terrible moment she understood the cruelty more deeply than before. If she looked too fiercely, it might betray care. If she looked away, it might betray care. To stand still required more courage than screaming. So she did what queens and captive daughters and wounded wives had done throughout history when men tried to turn them into tools. She turned her dignity into armor. I see nothing in him worth studying, she said. Andronikos laughed once without amusement. Then let us improve the material. The blows continued. Orhan Sahib took them in silence, though silence here was not absence. Inside him ran verses, names of Allah, fragments of prayer carried like water skins through the desert of pain. He thought of Bursa. He thought of the minarets. He thought of the Bay of Megara burning under a black sky. He thought of Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga driving fire into the heart of the crusade. He thought of Tarhan. He thought of Sultan Orhan. He thought of the old rule every spy learned, and every spy eventually had to test with flesh. Pain is a gate. Decide before it opens what may and may not pass through it. Nothing passed. At last Andronikos raised a hand. Enough, he said. The torturer stepped back. The cane was red at the tip. Andronikos leaned down near Orhan Sahib's face. You have discipline, I respect that, but discipline is not innocence. Often it is the surest sign of guilt. Tell me, Clems, if I open your chest, what would I find inside? Loyalty, gold, faith, some shepherd's oath sworn in a Turkish tent. Orhan Sahib turned his head just enough to look at him. If you opened my chest, Jahanpana, you would find a heart. And if you have forgotten what one looks like, no torture chamber will remind you. For the first time since the interrogation began, the room changed. The guards felt it. Asportia felt it. Even Shahin Shah, behind the lattice, lifted his head a fraction. Something in that answer had crossed a line, not because it confessed anything, but because it had struck too near the truth of Andronikos's rot. Andronikos straightened very slowly. "You speak boldly for a bound man," he said. "Boldness and chains have always known each other," Orhan Sahib replied. The next moment might have become execution if not for the pounding of hurried footsteps in the corridor. A guard entered, breathless, mud streaked to his knees. He dropped to one knee at once. Jahanpana, a messenger from the Valley of Scars. Urgent. Andronikos did not take his eyes off Orhan Sahib. "Speak." The guard swallowed. "Damir Khan has engaged the Ottoman vanguard," he said. The battle became, he hesitated, larger than expected. There are reports that Sultan Orhan himself arrived with the main army by the northern ridge. For the first time in several minutes, Andronikos looked away. "Continue." The guard's face tightened. Damir Khan's right flank was broken, Jahanpana. Mahmud attempted to stabilize the line, but what? The guard lowered his eyes. "Damir Khan is believed dead." The words struck the dungeon like another blow. Behind the lattice, Shahin Shah closed his eyes and let out the smallest breath, part bitterness, part vindication. Asportia felt her pulse leap. Orhan Sahib did not move, but his spirit sharpened. Sultan Orhan had reached the field. The valley had turned. Another front of the storm had broken in Ottoman favor. Andronikos stood utterly still. His jaw locked once, then again. He walked away from the table, every movement controlled with such precision that it became frightening. When he turned back, his eyes had gone colder than either rage or panic. Something final had entered them. "Dead," he said softly, "first the fleet, now Damir Khan." He looked at Orhan Sahib. "You hear that, Clems? The world is collapsing around me, and still I do not know whether you are loyal or lethal. I have no more time for uncertainty." He looked toward the guards. "Take him to the courtyard. Bind the Shahzadi as well. Bring Shahin Shah. If the rat is hidden among us, then let the whole fortress witness what becomes of those caught in my hand. Perhaps truth prefers daylight to iron." Shahin Shah suddenly spoke, his voice weak but threaded with the old venom of statecraft. "Grandson," he said, "if you kill every useful man in the fortress because fear has finally bitten you, you will save the Ottomans the trouble of defeating you." Andronikos turned toward the cage like a whip snapping. "And if I leave you alive much longer, old man, you will mistake survival for relevance." He gestured, "Bring him too." They unstrapped Orhan Sahib and hauled him upright. Every muscle across his back and ribs screamed, but he locked the pain away and walked under his own power. As they led him from the chamber, Shahin Shah was dragged from his confinement, too proud to beg, too weak to resist. For one brief moment, as they passed close, the emperor's ruined gaze met Orhan Sahib's. In those eyes was calculation still, and desperation, and the faintest hint of recognition, not of the face, but of the kind of man behind it. "You are no Roman," Shahin Shah whispered so low that only Orhan Sahib could hear. "Save me, and I will remember." Orhan Sahib did not slow. "Thrones are remembered by Allah," he said under his breath, "not sold in dungeons." Then they climbed. Above them, far beyond the stone and torchlight and iron, the battle in the Valley of Scars was still in motion, and history was being written in mud and steel. Damir Khan had not died quickly. Barhan Faladios found him near the shattered remains of the Byzantine center, where the ground had turned into a red swamp beneath the trample of horses and the weight of bodies. Damir's white stallion had been cut from under him by a spear thrust that came up through the chaos of legs and shields. The commander had rolled clear, rising to his feet with sword in hand, blood running down from a split on his forehead into one eye. Around him, the line was collapsing. Ottoman cavalry had torn open his right flank. Sultan Orhan's banner burned green above the ridge. Mahmud's reserve had been pushed back by Alauddin Sahib and Alauddin Sahib, who had descended from the eastern rise with fresh horsemen and turned what should have been support into panic. Damir Khan, however, had not yet accepted defeat. Men like him did not yield while they still possessed breath and steel. He hacked his way toward the nearest cluster of surviving officers, shouting for a rally, calling the imperial names, invoking Rome, the church, the emperor, anything that might hold the center together for one more minute. Then Barhan Faladios rode straight through the wreckage toward him. There was no mistaking Faladios on the field. His black horse was spattered to the chest in enemy blood. His lance had already broken in two bodies and was now discarded. He drew his sword instead, and the blade flashed white against the iron-colored sky. The bandages beneath his armor were soaked again from the torn wounds on his back, but pain had ceased to matter. His face was not the face of a man fighting a battle. It was the face of a verdict arriving. Damir Khan saw him and bared his teeth. "So the whipped dog still stands," he shouted over the roar of combat. "Yakid should have flayed deeper." Barhan Faladios brought his horse to a sliding halt and swung down in one smooth movement, boots sinking into the mud. "Yakid feeds worms," he said. "Mustafa feeds worms. And now I have come to ask whether the soil has room for one more traitor's friend." Damir spat blood and charged. Their swords met with a crack that rang across the bodies between them. Damir fought like a commander who knew all discipline and no mercy, efficient, heavy, cutting always for the quickest kill. Barhan fought like a man who had crossed through pain and found on the other side a precision more dangerous than fury. Damir struck high, low, then thrust. Barhan turned the blade, pivoted in the mud, and cut at the hamstring. Damir leaped back, barely saving the leg. Around them the battle raged, but a small circle of terror opened as men instinctively drew clear. Even soldiers fighting for their lives know when two commanders have met to settle more than a line. Damir grinned through the blood on his face. "The Ottomans are finished," he snarled. "Burn one fleet and another will come. Kill me and another commander will rise. Do you think history bends because you win a morning?" Barhan Faladios answered with steel. He pressed forward, 3 rapid cuts, the last of which slammed against Damir's guard hard enough to numb his arm. "History bends," Barhan said, "when men decide they will not kneel." Damir roared and lunged. The thrust was excellent. It would have taken the throat of almost any man alive. Barhan slipped outside it by the width of a prayer, caught Damir's wrist with his left hand, and drove his sword under the breastplate and up into the commander's chest. Damir Khan froze. For a moment he looked more surprised than wounded. He tried to speak. Blood filled his mouth before the words could emerge. Barhan leaned close, the way men lean in war when they want the last truth to be heard by dying ears alone. "This," Barhan said, "is for every road you thought fear would close to us." Then he twisted the blade and pulled it free. Damir Khan fell into the mud of the valley that had become his grave. The sight rippled through the Byzantines with devastating force. Their commander down, their center broken, their cavalry in chaos. Sultan Orhan's main force descending like judgment from the ridge. Men who had marched into the pass with drums now threw down shields to run faster. Others were trampled by their own retreat. Some tried to reach Mahmud, who was still fighting to gather the rear. But by then Fatima's arrows were finding every standard-bearer who tried to raise a rally point. She rode along the left with her bow singing, losing shafts so fast that the movement of her hand seemed less like archery and more like liturgy. One arrow took a hornman in the eye just as he tried to sound a regrouping blast. Another split the throat of a captain pulling men toward Mahmud's banner. Beside her, Evrenos had become something close to myth. His axe rose and fell in arcs that left shattered shields, broken clavicles, severed reins, and men simply erased from the momentum of battle. He laughed once, not from joy at killing, but from that terrible exaltation that comes when a warrior sees the enemy finally break before the weight of what he and his brothers have endured. For the daughter who will laugh, he thundered again, though no one around him understood why the words were holy. Fatima heard and did not turn, but her lips trembled with a smile the battlefield could not kill. On foot among the wreckage, Jarkata Sahib moved with his twin blades and his brother's name in every strike. He no longer fought for the line alone. He fought for the dead, for the betrayed, for the part of himself that had been buried with Boran and could not rest while Byzantine banners still flew over Ottoman blood. He carved through the rooted center and came within a horse length of Mahmud himself before a wave of retreating cavalry shoved between them. One of Mahmud's guards took Jarkata's right blade through the mouth. Another lost his hand at the wrist. But Mahmud, bleeding from an arrow wound in his shoulder where Fatima had marked him, wheeled his horse and fled with the remnants toward the western track. Jarkata would have followed. He would have hunted Mahmud to the edge of the world if allowed. But Tarhin was already at Sultan Arhan's side on the ridge, and with him came a captured courier, hauled up from the lower ravine by scouts of Zarkin. The courier had been riding hard from the Kanka. He knelt in the mud before the Sultan, face gray, hands shaking. Jahan Pana, he gasped, the fortress is sealed. Officers are being dragged to the dungeons. Andronikos seeks a spy among his own. The name spoken by the interrogators. The name was Clem's. Sultan Arhan did not move for a heartbeat. Then he looked toward the southern horizon where the Kanka lay beyond the folds of rock and forest, and the light in his eyes changed. Victory still thundered below him in the valley. Men still died in his name. Daimir Khan's line still crumbled. Yet in that instant the entire war narrowed to one point, one man, one mask in the enemy's house. Tarhan saw it too. He stepped forward before the Sultan spoke. "Let me go," he said. Sultan Arhan looked at him. They had known each other too long for ceremony. "Take 40 riders," the Sultan said. "No banners, no drums. Take the mountain gullies and the old shepherd roads. If there is a way into that fortress, you will find it. If there is no way, you will make one." Tarhan pressed fist to chest. "And if I am too late?" The Sultan's gaze hardened into something beyond grief. "Then bring me the names of the men who killed him," he said, "and I will write the rest of history with their blood." Tarhan bowed once. Then he was gone, already calling for his horse, already descending from the ridge with a picked band of Alps who could ride in silence and kill without needing light. Sultan Arhan turned back toward the battlefield below and raised his sword again. "No full pursuit," he commanded. "Break them, but do not scatter. Alauddin Sahib, seal the bridge road. Alauddin Sahib, take the left and cut off Mahmud's western flight. Barhin Faladios, hold the center and count the living. We march again before the dead are cold." Thus even victory was not allowed to rest. That is the nature of kingship in a world like this. A sultan may win a valley and still have no right to breathe. By the time Arhan Sahib was dragged into the courtyard of the Kanka, evening had already begun to gather in the high corners of the walls. Clouds had lowered. Torches burned all around the square. Soldiers were assembled in harsh rows. Officers stood under guard like condemned men awaiting a shared sentence. Kuledz's body had not yet been removed from where it had first fallen. Instead, it had been hauled upright and hung by the wrists against a pillar, as if to serve even in death as a warning against loose tongues and bad luck. Blood still dripped from the toe of one boot. Shahin Shah was brought out next and forced into a chair at the front, an emperor reduced to an exhibit. A sportia was bound to a post within sight of the scaffold block that had been set in the middle of the square. Arhan Sahib, still playing clems, was chained at the wrists to an iron ring sunk into the flagstones. Andronikos emerged onto the steps above them, dressed now in dark armor rather than robes. He had made himself not a prince but a judge, and because he had lost too much in too little time, he had also made himself executioner. "Soldiers of Rome," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air, "you have all heard the lies. You have all felt the trembling beneath these walls. The fleet in the south has burned. Damir Khan is fallen. Men you trusted have spoken like fools and died like traitors. But understand me, ships can be rebuilt. Armies can be raised again. What cannot be tolerated, what cannot be forgiven, what cannot be allowed to breathe 1 hour longer than necessary, is rot from within." He pointed toward Orhan Sahib with his sword. This man served near every secret and asked questions that were not his rank to ask. This man kills beyond his station. This man appeared where whispers began and returned alive from roads where others died. The quartermaster, before he expired, named him. Kuledz's own babbling placed him nearby. So now, before you all, I give him one final chance. Andronikos descended the steps and came to stand only a few paces away. "Who are you?" he asked. Orhan Sahib lifted his head. The bruises from the dungeon darkened his face. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth, yet when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I am the man who carried out your orders and brought you your prisoner." "Not good enough," Andronikos said. He turned toward Esportia. "And you, Shahzadi, you have known him on the road, you have ridden with him, you have watched him in the past. Tell me, is he what he claims to be?" The courtyard waited. Esportia looked at Orhan Sahib. He gave her nothing, no plea, no warning, no softness, only that same iron stillness which said, without speaking, decide as though empires depend on it, because sometimes they do. She turned back to Andronikos. "He is a man who serves the stronger side," she said coldly. "Whether that makes him yours or someone else's, only Allah knows." Murmurs, a dangerous answer, not a defense, not a condemnation, enough ambiguity to keep the fire alive. Andronikos smiled thinly. "Allah." He glanced at several soldiers. Curious word for a Roman woman raised in the emperor's halls to use so easily. Esportia's expression did not change. "Curiosity about God is often the first thing tyrants mistake for treason," she said. Several of the older soldiers lowered their eyes. Even now, even bound, the Shahzadi could cut. Andronikos stepped closer to her, and in a movement so fast it almost escaped sight, he seized the pendant at her throat and yanked it free from beneath her cloak. The silver necklace flashed in the torchlight. "What is this?" he asked. Esportia's breath caught despite herself. Orhan Sahib's chains rattled once as his hands tightened involuntarily. It was slight, tiny, but in a courtyard where all eyes hunted for cracks, even a heartbeat could be too loud. Andronikos saw it. "Ah," he said softly. He let the pendant hang from his fingers. "A husband's gift?" he asked Esportia. Esportia forced herself not to answer. Andronikos turned his head, very slowly, toward Orhan Sahib. "You looked," he said. Orhan Sahib said nothing. Andronikos took another step. "Why did you look, Clems? It is only jewelry, unless perhaps you knew it, unless perhaps you had seen it around her neck at moments you had no right to witness, unless perhaps—" A horn sounded from outside the walls. Every head in the courtyard turned toward the outer gate. A rider burst through the inner archway, horse lathered white, his own armor torn and blackened by smoke and battle. He half fell from the saddle and staggered forward. "Mahmud's banner is broken," he cried. "The Valley of Scars is lost. Damir Khan is dead. Sultan Orhan marches west." For one suspended instant, no one moved. Then panic, like a dam giving way. Officers shouted over one another. Soldiers turned in place. Men looked to the gate, the walls, the arsenal, the stables, calculating survival in every direction at once. The news from the sea had already cracked morale. The news from the valley shattered it. Andronikos closed his hand around Esporcha's necklace until the metal bit his palm. "There it is," he whispered, and now the words were for himself more than anyone else. The shape of betrayal, the timing, the precision, the impossible coordination. Ships in the south burned the same night my valley breaks. One hand, one hidden hand touching all of it. He turned with sudden violence and struck the messenger across the face with the hilt of his sword, dropping him to the stones. "No more reports," he said. "No more panic. We end the rot now." He looked at the crossbowmen on the parapet. Knock. Bolts were placed. Raise. The crossbows came down, aimed not outward but inward, toward the chained figure of Clems. Esporcha's breath stopped. "Who are you?" Andronikos asked one last time. Orhan Sahib lifted his face to the sky for the briefest fraction of a second, and in that glance he gave his soul upward. Not surrender, entrustment. Then he brought his gaze back to the Shahzada. "I am," he said, "a servant of the one who decides kings and ashes alike." Andronikos' mouth hardened. Fire. The bolts flew. And before they could reach him, another figure dropped from the roofline like a hawk from the sun. Tarhan hit the ground between Orhan Sahib and the incoming volley with shield raised and sword already in motion. The first two bolts slammed into the shield. The third he knocked aside with a brutal sweep that sent it spinning into a guard's throat. The fourth grazed his shoulder. The fifth struck the stones at Orhan Sahib's feet. Behind Tarhan, from the parapets, from the shadows of the upper galleries, from murder holes and hidden ledges that the garrison had stopped watching in its panic, Ottoman Alps erupted into motion. "Allahu Akbar!" Tarhan roared, and the cry detonated through the courtyard. Orhan Sahib. The name struck harder than any blade. Soldiers froze. Esporcha closed her eyes for a moment as if bracing herself before opening them into a world where Clems no longer existed. Shahin Shah stared, and though his body was ruined, something almost like old imperial astonishment flickered through him. Andronikos actually stepped backward. "Orhan," he said. Tarhan spun and drove his shield into the nearest guard, breaking the man's jaw, while with his free hand he hurled a short blade across the distance. It struck the iron pin of Orhan Sahib's wrist chain with a clang and bounced. Not enough. Orhan wrenched hard anyway, pain exploding through his shoulders. The pin loosened half a finger's width. Ottoman Alps flooded down the stairs and along the parapets, silent until now, killing with the terrifying economy of men who had lived their lives in the service of sudden violence. Crossbowmen died where they stood. A captain on the eastern stair took an axe to the spine. A torch stand toppled and rolled fire across the stones. Andronikos shouted for the gates to be sealed, for the archers to hold, for the Shahzadi to be secured, for Shahin Shah to be taken below, for anyone to restore order to what had, in the space of one heartbeat, become disaster. Tarhan slammed his sword against Orhan Sahib's chain. Once. Twice. On the third strike the iron ring split enough for Orhan to rip his right hand free, skin tearing at the knuckles. A dead guard's sword lay near. He snatched it up with his left first, switched hands, and then the courtyard received not Clems but Orhan Sahib in his full and terrible clarity. He moved at once toward Esporcha. Two Byzantines lunged to stop him. The first lost his hand at the wrist. The second took Orhan's shoulder into his chest and went backward into the post so hard the wood cracked. Orhan cut Esporcha's bonds in one sweep. "Stay behind me," he said. "I am behind no one," she said, seizing a fallen dagger. Even now, with fire climbing the pillars and soldiers dying all around them, the answer almost drew a grim smile from him. "Tarhan," Orhan called. "At your back, brother." And so they were, as they had been meant to be, Orhan Sahib and Tarhan, back to back in the courtyard of the enemy, one carrying the war inside, the other arriving from outside to keep that war alive. Crossbow bolts flew again from a surviving cluster on the western wall. Tarhan saw the angle, stepped across Orhan's flank and caught two on his shield. A third he struck out of the air with the flat of his sword. Then he led the charge up the lower stair, not waiting for permission, because some men are born with the strange gift of understanding exactly when battle must become motion and when motion must become salvation. He crashed into the crossbowmen like a released spring, cutting down one, hurling another over the battlement, kicking the third backward into the fire he had just tried to command. An arrow came at Orhan from the upper gallery. Tarhan saw it from the corner of his eye and turned, taking it in the rim of his shield before it could bury itself in Orhan's neck. Such was the work he had always done, intercepting death and passing it on. Below, Şahin Şah's guards tried to drag the old emperor back toward the keep. Esporcha saw it first. "My father." Orhan pivoted toward them, but Andronikos was there faster, not by courage but by calculation. He seized Şahin Şah by the collar and dragged him close, placing a sword across the old man's throat. Mahmud, pale from blood loss, had arrived through the eastern arch with a handful of surviving riders from the valley and now pushed toward the Shahzada through the chaos. "Stand back," Andronikos shouted. "One step more and the emperor dies here." The courtyard paused around the threat. Even men who had forgotten loyalty still remembered value. Şahin Şah was broken, but he remained a symbol. The old bloodline still carried weight among those who needed legality to wrap around their ambition. Alive, he was leverage. Dead, he was a martyr. Orhan Sahib stopped several paces away, sword low, breathing hard. "Release him," he said. Andronikos laughed, and the laugh had the edge of collapse in it. "Release him. You reveal yourself in my own fortress, you burn my fleet, you break my valley, and now you command me." Orhan Sahib's face was unreadable. "Your fleet was never yours. Your valley was never secure. Your fortress is already falling. Do not add the murder of your own blood to the list of your failures." Şahin Şah, dragged upright by the throat, wheezed and tried to speak. For one wild moment it looked as though he might curse them all. Then what came from him was different. "Orhan," he croaked, having heard Tarhan speak the name and understanding at last who stood before him. "If you are truly the one they fear, do not let this dog carry me in chains again." Andronikos pressed the blade deeper until blood appeared at the old man's neck. "One more step," he said, "and you watch him die." Orhan waited in a heartbeat. Distance, angle, Mahmud's surviving riders, Tarhan still on the stair, Esporcha free but exposed, Ottoman Alps cutting through the courtyard but not yet controlling the inner gate. The choice all commanders eventually face when the world narrows to impossible arithmetic: save the symbol, save the living, or save the battle. Before the calculation could settle, another sound tore across the Kanka. A horn from outside the walls. Not Byzantine. Ottoman. Then another, then the pounding of rams against the outer gate. Barhan Faladios had not rested after the valley, nor had Evrenos, nor Fatima, nor Jarkata Sahib. Sultan Orhan, having driven the Byzantine army from the pass and counted the living quickly rather than gently, had sent an advance force straight for the Kanka while the main body consolidated the roads. Barhan led it. Evrenos rode with him like a moving tower. Fatima's quiver was half spent, and she intended to empty the rest before night was done. Jarkata Sahib came silent and burning, twin blades at his hips, because there was still enemy breath under these walls, and that alone was enough reason. The first ram strike shook dust from the beams overhead, the second cracked the gate braces, the third split wood. Andronikos heard it, and his face became that of a man seeing the sea rise over his own deck for the second time in one day. "Mahmud," he barked. Mahmud pushed through with his riders, seized Şahin Şah's arm, and dragged the old emperor toward the side stair that led into the chapel wing. A hidden passage ran beneath it. Only the innermost circle knew. Andronikos backed with them, sword still up, still threatening, still calculating escape as if retreat were merely a more elaborate form of strategy. Orhan lunged. A rider intercepted. Orhan cut him down. Mahmud swung from horseback with his good arm. Orhan caught the strike and nearly took Mahmud's face, but the wounded commander twisted away just enough to lose only a piece of helm and skin. Esportia drove her dagger into the thigh of another rider who tried to seize her. The man screamed and fell underfoot. Tarhan leaped down from the stair and hit Mahmud's horse with such force that the animal staggered sideways, but not enough to unseat the commander. Andronikos and Mahmud reached the chapel arch with Şahin Şah between them. Orhan, Esportia cried. Orhan started forward again, but this time a volley from the last surviving crossbowman came from the chapel balcony itself. Tarhan stepped across his path and shielded him. One bolt struck the shield. Another punched through the leather edge and into Tarhan's upper arm. He grunted, broke the shaft off with one savage twist, and kept moving. "Go," he shouted to Orhan. "I will clear the balcony." "No," Orhan said, because he had already seen the hidden stone panel grinding open behind Andronikos. Another few heartbeats and they would vanish with Şahin Şah into the bowels of the fortress, and from there perhaps out into the mountains. Then the outer gate exploded inward. Barhan Faladios entered first under a rain of splinters and sparks, sword in hand, armor still stained from the valley. Evrenos followed beside him with his axe raised. Fatima was already losing before her horse fully cleared the breach. Her arrow took a fleeing guard through the spine. Behind them poured Ottoman Alps and Sepahis, and with them the battle for the Kanka ceased to be an infiltration and became conquest. Jarkata Sahib came through the smoke like a memory of death the fortress had failed to bury. He saw the courtyard. He saw Kuledz's body hung as warning. He saw Ottoman and Byzantine dead mixed together. He saw the chapel arch where Andronikos was retreating. Without needing explanation, he ran. "Barhan," Orhan shouted, pointing. Barhan Faladios understood at once. He drove toward the chapel through the melee, Evreno smashing a path open beside him. But distance is cruel in war. A few paces too many, a few bodies too much, a single shield in the wrong place, sometimes that is enough to save a villain for another day. The stone panel behind Andronikos began to close. Şahin Şah, half dragged and half pulled, looked back once. At Esportia, at Orhan, at the courtyard falling to Ottoman steel. His face held not relief but a desperate fury, because even now he was not being rescued, he was being transferred from one leverage to another. He reached out a hand toward his daughter, but Mahmud jerked him backward. The stone narrowed. Light became slit. Then crack. Then nothing. They were gone. Jarkata Sahib hit the sealed panel with both blades in a fury that sent sparks across the chapel floor. Solid stone. Evreno slammed his shoulder into it and earned nothing but pain. Barhan Faladios arrived a breath later, saw the sealed passage, and understood. "He escaped," Barhan said. With Şahin Şah, Esportia answered, her voice breaking for the first time. Orhan Sahib stood still in the center of the wrecked courtyard and let the facts settle. The fortress was theirs. The fleet was ashes. The valley had been won. The traitor Mustafa was dead. And still Andronikos had found a way to keep one hand on legitimacy by carrying Şahin Şah into the dark. Victory, in other words, remained incomplete, and incomplete victories are often the hardest to hold. But there was no time to grieve what had not been saved. Around them, fighting still flared in pockets through the Kanka. Mahmud's surviving riders tried to break through the stables and were cut down by Fatima's arrows and Evrenos's axe. Tarhan led a climb to the chapel balcony and cleared the last crossbowman, though blood now soaked down his arm from the bolt wound. Altadin Sahib's men secured the gatehouse. Al-Aliuddin Sahib's scouts spread through the inner keep, seizing maps, ledgers, seals, and prisoners before fire or panic could destroy them. And in the midst of this storm, Orhan Sahib finally allowed Clems to die. He tore the enemy cloak from his shoulders and cast it into the flames, licking at a fallen banner. Beneath it remained the battered armor and the blood and the bruises, But now when the Ottoman men looked at him, they saw not a Roman soldier but the man who had walked for months under a false face and returned with empires burning behind him. Tarhan came down from the stair, shield dented, arm bleeding, face streaked black with smoke. He stopped in front of Orhan Sahib, and for 1 second the roar of the battle around them receded. "Brother," Tarhan said. "Brother," Orhan answered. Tarhan glanced toward the sealed chapel passage. He took Shahin Shah. "I know. Then we will hunt him." Orhan looked past him at the chaos of the courtyard, at Asportia standing amid it with Kuledz's blood still drying on the stones and Shahin Shah vanished behind enemy walls, at Barhan Faladio's issuing orders despite the blood at his back, at Fatima checking Evrenos's side for wounds even as she drew another arrow, at Jarkata, Sahib wiping his blades and staring at the chapel as though he could burn through rock by hatred alone. "Yes," Orhan said, "we will hunt him, but not blindly." A trumpet sounded from the outer yard. Sultan Orhan himself had arrived with the forward body of the main army. The surviving defenders of the Kanka laid down their arms in clusters or died where they stood. When the Sultan entered the courtyard and saw Orhan Sahib alive, something unspoken passed across his face: relief, pride, the exhaustion of command, and the knowledge that in another world, in an easier age, he might have embraced the man at once. But kings in the middle of war rarely receive the luxury of pure emotion. Instead he walked to him, looked once at the wounds on his body and said, "You kept faith." Orhan bowed his head, "By Allah's mercy and the speed of Tarhan." The Sultan turned to Tarhan and gripped his forearm hard enough to communicate everything words would only weaken. Then he looked around the captured Kanka. "Report." It came in fragments as battle reports always do. Daimir Khan dead, Mahmud wounded but escaped into the hidden route, Shahin Shah taken with him, the fortress secured, documents seized, prisoners held, casualties mounting but acceptable considering the gain. The inner dungeons full of men Andronikos had begun to break under interrogation, some still alive, some not. Sultan Orhan listened to each piece and assembled the shape of the next war in his mind, even as the current one still smoked around him. He ordered the chapel passage opened by engineers before dawn. He ordered Killil summoned to study the tunnels and estimate their outlets. He ordered Zarkin to scour the seized records for routes to Yodos and to any loyalist houses still willing to hide the Shahzada. He ordered Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga, once they came in from the sea, to blockade any crossing that might carry Andronikos toward the capital. He ordered the dead buried separately, Ottoman with prayer, Byzantine with count, traitors unnamed. And after that, when the initial commands had gone out and the fires were finally being beaten down rather than fed, the night thinned enough to allow quieter reckonings. Asportia stood near the pillar where Kuleds had been hung, her necklace restored to her throat after Orhan took it back from Andro's dropped hand in the struggle. She watched as Ottoman soldiers brought out the tortured prisoners from the lower cells, men who had screamed under Andronikos' fear, and now blinked at freedom as though it were another kind of pain. Among them were clerks, quartermasters, guards, a priest with 2 broken fingers, and a stable boy who could not stop shaking. War does not only destroy armies, it hollows buildings from within and fills them with ghosts. Orhan came to stand beside her. "He took my father," she said without looking at him. "I know. He will use him." "Yes." She turned then, her eyes were dry now. Grief had passed into something sharper. "Then we go after him." Orhan looked at her long enough that she understood the shape of his thought before he spoke it. "We do," he said, "but we do not do it as desperate fugitives. We do it as those who just took his fortress, burned his fleet, broke his army and left him with nothing but tunnels and borrowed legitimacy. A wounded wolf still bites, Asportia. We will hunt him with spears, not bare hands." She breathed in, held it and let it go. "Then take me with you when you go." "That is not decided tonight." "It is decided in me," she replied. Nearby, Evrenos finally let Fatima look properly at the long slice across his side that he had pretended not to feel while the fighting lasted. She cursed at him in a low voice for a fool while tying the bandage tighter. He smiled in that infuriating way of men who believe being stitched by the one they love is almost worth the wound that made it necessary. She told him if he smiled again, she would tie the bandage around his mouth instead. He answered that if she did, he would still grin through it. She almost laughed despite the dead around them, and the almost was enough to keep both of them human. Barhan Falladio stood with Sultan Arhan and reviewed the seized maps. Blood had dried stiff across his back under the armor. He would need a physician before dawn or the wounds Yakid's cave had reopened would turn foul. But he did not mention it. He spoke instead of roads, of supply depots, of the western tracks Mahmud might use. He marked one route with his finger and said, if he carries Shahin Shah, he will need guarded stops, water and men loyal enough to risk the Sultan's wrath. That limits him. Yodos is possible. The old monastery road is possible. The hill fort above Samindra is possible, nothing else. Jarkata Sahib came to them and said only, give me the first trail and I will give you the first dead man on it. Sultan Arhan looked at him and knew the answer was already in him, hard and unchangeable. Not alone, he said. Jarkata's mouth tightened. I was not alone in the valley. I was not alone in Yakid's blood. I am not asking for solitude. I am asking for permission to be first. You will have it, the Sultan said. Thus command works when it is wise. It does not try to extinguish fire, only to direct it where it will do the most good. Later, much later, when the moon had climbed and the Kanka had become less a battlefield than a captured ruin, Arhan Sahib descended once more to the dungeon where Andronikos had tried to peel truth out of him. The torches there burned lower now. The instruments still hung where they had hung. Shahin Shah's cage stood empty. On the table lay the dark stain of his own blood from the interrogation. He stood in the chamber alone for a time and let the silence settle around him. This was what victory looked like at close range. Not banners, not songs, not clean endings. A room where pain had been administered by men who feared losing power more than losing their souls. A captain dead because he had been foolish. A traitor buried nameless. An emperor stolen through a hidden passage. A husband alive by inches and timing. A wife whose father had vanished again before she could touch him. A sultan above ground already planning the next march because survival left him no choice. Arhan placed one hand on the stained wood of the table and closed his eyes. Alhamdulillah, he whispered, not because everything had been saved, but because enough had been saved to continue. When he returned above, Tarhan was waiting in the corridor, arm freshly bound, leaning against the wall as if wounds were an inconvenience rather than evidence. They stood together for a moment in the half-light. You should rest, Tarhan said. Arhan almost smiled, so should you. Tarhan shrugged, I will, when Andronikos is either chained or dead. Arhan looked toward the chapel wing where the hidden passage waited to be opened by hammers and crowbars. He has lost the sea, he said. He has lost the valley. He has lost this fortress. But now he has no illusions left, and that makes him more dangerous than before. Tarhan nodded. Men are most lethal after their dreams burn. Then we must reach him before he builds new ones. From the outer courtyard came the low sound of Ottoman soldiers reciting prayers over the dead. Names were spoken. Verses answered them. Cloth was drawn over faces. Somewhere another wounded man cried out for water. Somewhere a horse stamped. Somewhere Fatima finally allowed herself to sit, and Evrenos sat beside her, not touching her hand but close enough that the warmth was there. Somewhere Barhan Falladios bent over the maps again while a physician argued with him about rest. Somewhere Jarkata Sahib sharpened both blades, though they needed little sharpening, because some men can only be still when their hands are in motion. And above all of it, on the battlements of the Kanka now flying the banner of Sultan Arhan, the night looked unchanged. The same stars, the same cold wind, the same dark road stretching westward toward fortresses not yet taken, alliances not yet broken, blood not yet spilled. That is the deceit of history when seen from far away. It seems clean. It seems orderly. It seems that after a fortress falls and a fleet burns and a valley is won, the line of events should naturally proceed toward peace. But peace is not a road. It is a country, and men at war must conquer miles of grief before they ever glimpse its border. Before dawn, the engineers broke through the first layer of the chapel stone and found behind it the narrow throat of a passage descending into the hill. Fresh torch soot marked the walls. A dropped strip of imperial cloth lay caught on a jagged edge. They had gone that way indeed, and not long before. Sultan Orhan was summoned at once. He came, looked into the darkness, and said nothing for several breaths. Then he turned and gave the orders that would carry the war forward again. Scouts in all directions. No fires on the pursuit roads. Jarkata Saheb with the first riders. Barhan Faladios to command the main western pursuit once his wounds were wrapped. Fatima and Evrenos with the forward screen. Tarhan with Orhan Saheb to follow the tunnel intelligence and read the enemy's habits, because no one alive understood Andronikos' mind as well as the man who had stood under his gaze and survived. Altuddin Saheb to hold the Kanka, Al-Aliuddin Saheb to bring supply, Zarkin to read the seized papers until his eyes failed or he found the next key, Killil to map the outlets before sunrise, Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga when they made landfall to close every port west of the bay. The war, in other words, did not pause to honor what had already been achieved. It demanded more. And so we leave them there, not in triumph, though triumph has touched them, and not in despair, though despair has bitten them too, but in that harsher and more truthful place between the two where real history lives. We leave Orhan Saheb with his mask finally burned away and a new hunt before him. We leave Tarhan bleeding through a fresh bandage and already preparing to ride again. We leave Asportia with the necklace at her throat and her father stolen back into darkness. We leave Sultan Orhan in a captured fortress, victorious and burdened, because kings are never allowed one without the other. We leave Barhan Faladios wounded yet mounted, Evreno smiling through pain, Fatima fierce and silent, Jarkata Saheb sharpened into an edge no grief can blunt. And somewhere ahead on a western road or beneath a ruined monastery or inside the walls of Yodos or some hill fort not yet named, Andronikos rides with Shahin Shah in his grasp and Mahmud at his side, wounded, furious, stripped of ships and valley and fortress, but not yet stripped of ambition. He is more dangerous now because he has been humiliated, more cruel because he has been cornered, more willing than ever to trade blood for time. The sea has burned, the valley has broken, the Kanka has fallen. And still the war is not over. It has only changed its face again. The tunnel breathed cold air up from the earth like the exhalation of a buried beast. When the first stones were pried fully loose, and the narrow black throat of the hidden passage revealed itself beneath the chapel, every man standing there understood that the war had shifted again. Not away from blood, never away from blood, but away from the open thunder of the valley and back into the old, merciless craft of pursuit, deception, and timing. Sultan Orhan stood over the opening with the torchlight wavering across his face, and for a long moment he said nothing, because silence is sometimes the final test before command. Around him, men waited. Barhan Faladios waited with his wounded back strapped tight beneath his armor. Evrenos waited with his axe across one shoulder. Fatima waited with bow in hand and eyes like drawn steel. Jarkata Saheb waited already half inside the future. Tarhan stood like a shadow beside Orhan Saheb, and Asportia stood several paces away with her father's absence burning in her chest like a second heart. At last Sultan Orhan looked toward Killil, who had knelt near the opening with soot-blackened fingers and a map board balanced on one knee. "What do the stones say?" he asked. Killil leaned close to the dark mouth of the passage, studying the incline, the moisture on the walls, the age of the mortar, the air that rose from below carrying the smell of earth, fungus, old water, and the faintest residue of recent torch smoke. "This tunnel was not made for escape alone," he said quietly. It is old, older than Andronikos, older than the Şahin Şah. It belongs to the first foundations of this fortress, when kings trusted stone less than fear, and always built themselves a second road beneath the first. The slope turns westward. There will be at least two possible exits if the old builders followed common practice, one toward the lower ravine and one toward the abandoned monastic hills. If Andronikos is clever, and he is, he will divide the signs and take the route least expected. Zarkin, who had spent the entire night reading seized ledgers and coded correspondence by lantern light until his eyes had gone red, stepped forward with one folded parchment in hand. In the papers taken from the command chamber, he said, there are references to a refuge named the House of St. Varon. It is written as a supply marker, but the quantities do not fit any monastery. Too much grain for monks, too much lamp oil for prayer halls, and too many references to winter blankets and horse feed. It is no monastery. It is a hidden station. If Andronikos planned for failure, and every desperate prince plans for failure while pretending to plan only for victory, then St. Varon is likely one of his shelters. How far? Sultan Orhan asked. If the western tunnel meets the lower gullies, a mounted group could reach it by tomorrow's sunset, Zarkin replied. On foot through the tunnel, slower. But if Mahmud is wounded and Şahin Şah is being dragged more than carried, then speed will not be what saves them. Secrecy will. Asportia stepped forward then, the cloak around her shoulders stirring in the cold draft that rose from beneath the chapel floor. Then we go now, she said. Every breath we waste gives him distance. Every minute my father remains in that man's grip is another minute of humiliation he does not deserve. Sultan Orhan turned his gaze to her, and though he did not speak harshly, kings have a way of placing the whole weight of reality into a single look. Your father is a hostage and a symbol both, he said. I know what he means to you, but I cannot chase him with grief. I must chase him with judgment. Then judge quickly, Asportia answered, her voice tightening, because Andronikos will not keep him alive out of mercy. No, Sultan Orhan said, he will keep him alive out of need, and need can be studied, need can be trapped. Orhan Sahib said nothing through this exchange. He stood with one shoulder still stiff from the bolts and the beating in the dungeon, his knuckles raw where the chain had torn skin from bone, and listened. He listened not only to the words but to the spaces between them, the currents of intention, fear, and calculation that men of war learn to hear as clearly as commands. He had walked too long inside Andronikos's walls not to understand what desperation would do to that man now. A prince who loses a fleet may tell himself he can raise another. A prince who loses a valley may dream of yet another campaign. A prince who loses his fortress, his officers, his secrecy, his timing, and the illusion that he governs events rather than reacting to them becomes either broken or monstrous. Andronikos was not made to break, therefore he would become more monstrous still. Tarhan shifted slightly beside him. Orhan did not look at him, but he heard the old question there all the same. Where do we strike first? Sultan Orhan gave the answer aloud. Jarkata Sahib, you take 12 riders and the lower ravine route. No banners, no campfires. If you find sign, you do not attack unless you are certain of success or certain that delay kills Şahin Şah. Barhin Faladios, once the physician has bound you well enough to keep your blood inside you, you will follow with 40 more and hold the second line. Fatima Evrenos, you ride ahead of Faladios and sweep the monastic hills. Killil, you will go with them. I want every ruin, cistern, shepherd fold, and hidden path named before nightfall. Tarhan and Orhan Sahib will take the tunnel itself with a small party. If there are traps, false doors, deadfalls, or signs left to mislead a surface pursuit, they are the men best suited to read them. Al-Aliaddin Sahib will hold the Kanka with Altuddin Sahib. Abdul Rahman and Tamir Boga will close the western crossings once they make landfall. Zarkin remains with me. I want every scrap of paper from this fortress turned into roads in my mind before the sun reaches its height. The orders moved outward at once, and men scattered to obey. This is the thing about great commanders in ages of iron and smoke. They do not waste movement on grief until grief can be afforded. Barhan Faladios was already turning toward the courtyard to find the physician, though his face betrayed his displeasure at losing even the shortest measure of time to bandages. Jarkata Sahib had no such delay. He simply bowed once, turned, and vanished at the run, as though someone had loosed an arrow in human form. Fatima and Evrenos moved together, not touching, not needing to, because war had burned so much pretense from the world that between people like them silence became a stronger clasp than hands. Kilo rushed after them with maps and measuring cords. Above them, the first light of morning had begun to stain the eastern sky, pale and cold, and almost ashamed to look upon what men had done before dawn. Orhan Sahib and Tarhan descended into the tunnel first. The passage narrowed quickly after the opening, forcing them to go single file. Two Alps followed behind them with hooded lamps whose light was muted to preserve the darkness ahead. The ceiling dipped low in places. The walls sweated moisture. Ancient roots hung down through cracks in the stone like the fingers of the dead. Every few steps the tunnel changed character slightly, old brick giving way to rougher excavation, then returning again to dressed stone where old masons had strengthened a weak seam. It was a road made by fear and preserved by secrecy, and Orhan Sahib could feel the mind of its builders in the arrangement of each turn. Narrow here to slow many men, broaden there to form a kill pocket, a side alcove for a guard with a bow, a slope steep enough to flood if an upper sluice were opened. Men had trusted this tunnel only because they had first made it dangerous to use. Tarhan knelt at the first fork and touched the earth. Fresh scrape marks, he said, dragging weight, not one man, at least two carried or forced. And here he pointed to a darker stain in the clay blood, not much. Mahmud's shoulder perhaps, or Shahinshah's neck where the blade grazed him. Orhan crouched beside him. The left branch is cleaner, he murmured, too clean. They brushed the walls there with cloth to confuse direction. No hurried group does that unless they expect pursuit. The right branch shows more disturbance. They want us to distrust the obvious track. So we take the right, Tarhan asked. Orhan shook his head. No, we split the thought, not the men. Send one Alp 10 paces into the right branch, no farther, and have him listen. Then we take the left. Tarhan smiled faintly, the way he always did when the old rhythm returned between them. You hear him the way I hear arrows, he said. I hear what fear would like me to hear, Orhan answered. Then I walk where it would least like me to go. The Alp did as ordered, 10 paces into the right branch, then back, reporting damp air, slow water, no fresh torch scent. A runoff tunnel, likely a dead branch that emerged lower on the hill, useful for deception, nothing more. The left carried the faint animal smell of horses once kept below, and beneath that the fresher ghost of extinguished pitch. They went that way. As they advanced, the passage broadened into a chamber supported by squat pillars blackened from old smoke. On one wall had been painted a faded icon of a saint whose face had long since peeled away, leaving only 2 dark circles where eyes had been. The Alps shifted uneasily. Men at war often fear painted silence more than steel. Orhan stepped across the chamber and found what he expected near the far exit. The remains of a torch hastily crushed under a boot, and beside it, a snapped buckle from an imperial riding bridle. Mahmud's people changed horses above this point once, he said. There must be a stable yard or concealed pen near the exit. If they had prepared for flight, they would not trust one mount to carry an emperor and a wounded commander through the western ridges. Tarhan rested his good hand on the wall and closed his eyes for one moment, listening not with ears alone, but with that sharpened instinct born from years of surviving on edges. Then he opened them again. We will not catch them in the tunnel, he said, but perhaps we can catch what they left behind. They are moving with a burden and with wounded pride. Men in that state discard what they think no one will read. And so they read. A smear where a shoulder brushed too hard against lime wash. A footprint turned at the heel, indicating a stumble under weight. A tiny thread of purple silk caught on a jagged stone, not Shahanshah's but the expensive inner binding of Mahmud's cloak. Every sign spoke. The trick was not merely to see it but to understand what kind of man had made it. That was Arhan's gift and Tarhan. And together in the old tunnel beneath the fallen Kanka, they became once more what the empire had forged them to be. Interpreters of absence, historians of movement, readers of fear. Above ground, the hunt spread like a net cast wide across the western hills. Jarkata Sahib rode first through the lower ravine with 12 chosen riders, all of them light, all of them silent, all of them men who knew how to read the language of disturbed grass and broken lichen, and the angle of pebbles kicked downhill. The ravine opened and closed unpredictably, twisting through black rock and thorn scrub, with caves hidden among the folds where shepherds sometimes slept and murderers sometimes waited. Jarkata did not look left or right longer than necessary. He did not need scenery. He needed a trail. At one narrow bend he reined in, dismounted, and walked to a patch of wet clay sheltered under an overhang. Hoof marks. 4 horses at least, perhaps 6. One animal favoring its front left, another bearing double weight, and one print deeper at the edge where a horse had resisted entering the bend because it smelled blood. He touched the print, then looked west. They came this way, he said. Then he mounted and rode harder. Behind him, the hills began to wake under the movement of larger forces. Barhan Faladios, despite the physician's curses and Fatima's disapproval, was back in the saddle before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The wounds on his back were newly packed with salve and bound so tightly that each breath felt as if an iron band had been clenched around his ribs. But some men are kept alive less by comfort than by purpose, and purpose rode in him now stronger than fever. Fatima came to his stirrup before he departed, her expression hard with worry she had no intention of softening. "If the bindings tear again," she said, "you tell me at once." Barhan almost smiled. "If the bindings tear again, there will be enough blood on everyone that you will not know which of it is mine." "That is not wit," she said. "That is stubbornness disguised in poor clothing." "Then I must have dressed in haste." She looked at him with the flat stare only a woman who has rescued a man from torture may use, and Evrenos, hearing the exchange while mounting nearby, made the grave mistake of grinning. Fatima turned that stare on him as well. "And if you laugh one more time while your side leaks," she said, "I will sew you to your horse and leave you there." Evrenos touched fist to chest in mock submission, "As my commander decrees." But after she turned away, he murmured to Barhan, "If she threatens to sew me, it means I still live in her sight. That is more than many men receive from fate." Barhan glanced at him, "Then live long enough to keep receiving it." They rode. Farther north in the monastic hills, abandoned bell towers and shattered cloisters crouched like broken teeth against the skyline. Fatima, Evrenos, and Killil moved through them with a mixed screen of scouts and archers, checking cisterns, crypt entrances, wine cellars, shepherd huts, and shrines carved into the rock. Killil muttered constantly to himself as he compared what he saw to the half-ruined monastery maps recovered from the Kanka. Here a wall had collapsed and changed a path. There a dry stream had cut a new descent into the hill, creating a hidden route not marked in any old chart. Once, in the apse of a roofless chapel, Fatima found a strip of cloth torn from a bishop's travel case and still smelling faintly of medicinal herbs. Mahmud had likely raided the place earlier in the season for supplies. Another thread in the tapestry, another sign that Saint Varan was not fiction. Back at the Kanka, Sultan Arhan moved through the captured command rooms while Zarkin read and reread everything Andronikos had left behind or failed to destroy. There were ecclesiastical seals, shipping inventories, coded church correspondence, names of nobles bought with promises of restoration, lists of villages suspected of Ottoman sympathy, and several curious notes marked not with titles but with saints' names. Saint Varan among them, Saint Elias, Saint Pharos. Zarkin spread these notes across the large table where Andronikos had once planned the crushing of the Ottomans, and now that same table served the opposite destiny. Sultan Orhan listened as Zarkin mapped the pattern aloud. "These are not monasteries alone," Zarkin said. "They are nodes, hiding houses, relay stations, safe storehouses built beneath the language of piety. The church sends oil and bread, the prince stores spears and fresh mounts. The bishops pray, the couriers pass under the prayer halls. It is old Roman practice wrapped in holy cloth." Sultan Orhan looked at the notes for a long time. "Then we do not merely pursue a fleeing prince," he said. "We begin cutting a network." "Yes," Zarkin replied. "And if we cut it well, Andronikos will discover what it means to have every sanctuary become a trap." That was the strategic aftermath taking shape. No longer only the saving of Bursa or the burning of a fleet, but the dismantling of a hidden structure that had allowed Byzantium and its allies to survive by burrowing beneath the earth of open defeat. The war had become deeper, more intimate, less about front lines than about arteries. And while the empire rearranged itself around this new truth, another quieter drama unfolded within Bursa itself. In the palace nursery, Gonza sat by the window with her infant son asleep against her breast. The child's tiny mouth opened and closed in dreams no one could interpret. Aladdin sat opposite her with a parchment in hand, though he had not read the same line for several minutes. The news of the fleet's destruction had reached the palace first as rumor, then as report, then as certainty. The news from the valley followed, and with it came the names of the living and the dead. Every hour a new rider brought more. Every hoofbeat into the courtyard made servants flinch. Gonza looked down at her son and then at Aladdin. "You are not here," she said softly. He blinked and lowered the parchment. "I am here." "Your body is here," she said. "Your mind has been in the western hills since before dawn." Aladdin rubbed his face. "My father rides. Burhan rides wounded. Orhan Sahib has thrown away his mask. Tarhan bleeds in some dark tunnel and probably calls it a scratch. Jarkata hunts as though grief itself were a horse under him, and I sit in silk." "You sit where you were ordered," Gonza said. "And the order gnaws." She was silent a moment. Then she rose carefully, crossed the room, and placed the child in his arms. Aladdin stiffened at first, then softened as the boy settled against him. "This," Gonza said, touching the child's cheek, "is also a front in the war. Do not despise it because there is no mud on the floor. If men like you do not live to hold children, then all these riders and swords and graves are only madness with banners." Aladdin looked at his son for a long time. The infant yawned and tightened one tiny fist against the cloth at his father's chest. Something in Aladdin's face broke and reformed. He kissed the child's forehead and whispered a prayer into the fine dark hair. In another chamber, Nilüfer stood with Suleiman and Qasim at the balcony rail and watched the courtyards below. The boys had heard enough to know that their father was in the field and that victory and danger often rode together. Suleiman asked no childish questions anymore. He watched the messengers and the guards and tried to read the truth from adult silences. "Will Baba come back this time?" Qasim asked. Nilüfer placed one hand on each son's shoulder. "He will come back as Allah wills," she said. "And whether he comes today or after many days, you will stand straight when he does. Do not let fear teach your bones to bend." Suleiman looked up at her. "And if the enemy comes here?" "Then this palace becomes a fortress," Nilüfer said. "And if the fortress falls, then this family becomes a wall. That is what our blood is for." The boy said nothing more. But in that silence something ancient entered him, the first hard grain from which later men are made. West of all these scenes, beneath the hills, Orhan Sahib and Tarhan emerged from the tunnel in a grove of black cypresses near a ruined stable yard half hidden behind a collapsed retaining wall. The stable was empty now, but fresh dung, churned straw, and cut reins told enough of the story. They had changed mounts here indeed, and in haste. One of the Alps found a scrap of cloth wedged into a broken post, purple, Mahmud. Another found a torn wrapper from dried figs, still damp where it had been dropped not long before. Tarhan crouched near the yard's edge, studying where the hoof tracks fanned out. They split the signs here, he said. 4 riders headed west on the open track. 2 more lighter went south and then doubled back. Decoys. But this one, he touched a deeper line near the stone trough. This one turned northwest toward the pines. He carried weight and was led, not ridden. A spare horse for Şahin Şah if they were forced to dismount. Orhan scanned the tree line. The clever move would be the decoy, he said. Therefore Mahmud may have insisted on it. But Andronikos is vain enough to keep the emperor close to his own hand. He will not trust his symbol to distance unless no other choice remains. Northwest. Then northwest, Tarhan said. They mounted and rode. By midday the pursuit lines began to converge. Jarkata Sahib's riders found the edge of the pine route. Fatima's scouts in the monastic hills sighted smoke from a cook fire too disciplined to belong to herdsmen and too small to belong to monks. Barhan Faladios reached the old ridge road and sent half his men toward St. Elias while taking the rest himself toward St. Varan. Kilil, spattered with mud and triumph, arrived at the same conclusion from opposite evidence and swore, by all honest mapmakers, that the enemy had chosen the old pilgrim route only because it looked pious enough to seem harmless. In the late afternoon, as the sun tilted and the light turned bronze upon the ridges, Jarkata Sahib found the first body. It lay in a shallow ditch beside the pine road, one of Mahmud's outriders, throat cut, no sign of Ottoman steel, no stripping, no theft, just death and abandonment. Jarkata dismounted and rolled the corpse over with one boot. The man's eyes had been left open. In them remained the frozen surprise of someone killed by his own side or by allies who no longer had room for weakness. Jarkata looked down the road and understood. They are shedding weight, he said. Wounded men, slow men, anyone who cannot keep pace. They are frightened. Good, said one of his riders. No, Jarkata answered. Frightened men become inventive, ride harder. At nearly that same hour, Tarhan, Orhan Sahib, and their small party reached the outskirts of the house of St. Varan. From a distance it looked exactly what it pretended to be, an old stone monastery clinging to a shelf of rock above a narrow stream, with a bell tower missing its bell and a kitchen garden gone wild behind low walls. Vines climbed the chapel face. Smoke rose in a thin, peaceful line from one chimney. The icon over the gate had weathered so badly that the saint's features were almost gone. A traveler might have passed and thought of prayer, poverty, and harmless decay. Orhan Sahib looked at the lines of the walls, the hidden slits where there should have been only arrow loops for crows, the stable roof low behind the orchard, the way the garden wall had been thickened in sections to create cover. No monastery, he said. No, Tarhan agreed, a lie with an altar. They drew back into the trees to wait for the others. No one was eager to rush such a place blind, not after tunnels and decoys and all the evidence of Andronikos' preparation. As they waited, Orhan watched the gate through branches and thought not of strategy for one rare moment, but of Şahin Şah. The old emperor had been taken from one cage to another. He had lived long enough to become symbol rather than sovereign, and symbols are seldom granted kindness by history. If saved, he might become useful, dangerous, grateful, manipulative, or all at once. If lost, Andronikos would claim to speak for him even in death. There were no clean outcomes left, only better and worse ones. Tarhan, still binding his wounded arm tighter with his teeth and one hand, glanced sideways. You are thinking like Zarkin, he said. God forbid, Orhan replied. Tarhan let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. There, you live still. A dead man would not joke. Orhan looked back at the monastery. A living man also knows when he is tired enough to make mistakes. Then lean on me before the mistake, not after it, Tarhan said simply. These were the vows men like them made, not at altars, not in courts, in mud and branches and the pauses before bloodshed. The riders came before sunset. First Jarkata with his 12 appearing through the pines like riders cut from the bark itself. Then Fatima and Evrenos from the southern slope, Killil behind them with 2 scouts. At last Barhan Faladios with his 40, pale under the beard but upright and unbent, because some men are held together less by flesh than by command. When he saw the monastery, his expression tightened. "Saint Varan," he said, "so the saint has teeth." Orhan Sahib gathered them beneath the trees and laid out what the walls told him. 2 gate guards hidden, not visible. At least 1 upper watch slit in the bell tower. Stable access behind the orchard. Kitchen yard likely linked to a cellar. If Andronikos is here, he will keep Shahin Shah underground or in the old chapter room where thick walls can turn one hostage into a fortress. Mahmud will hold the escape route, not the front gate. He is too practical to trust appearances. "And the monks?" Fatima asked. "There may be 2 or 3 real ones," Orhan said. "Men paid to keep the prayer true enough that the lie survives. Or none at all. Either way, assume every robe hides a knife." Barhan Faladios studied the fading light. "If we assault at dusk, they will expect shadows and lose less to surprise. If we wait until full dark, we risk them slipping out through some animal track the maps never held." Evrenos rested the head of his axe against the ground. "Then we strike at prayer time," he said. "Whether they are real monks or false ones, there will be a rhythm in the place. Bells, lamps, movement toward the chapel, movement away from the yard. Every house of ritual has a heartbeat. Break it and the body stumbles." Killil nodded reluctantly. He is right. These compounds are built around habit. When habit is interrupted, men show their secret doors. Jarkata Sahib said nothing for several breaths. Then he pointed to the bell tower. "Mine." Fatima glanced at him. "And if the bell rings?" "Then it rings over dead hands," he said. Thus the plan formed. Jarkata with 2 climbers to the bell tower, Fatima and archers to cover the wall slits. Evrenos and Barhan at the gate once the tower was silent. Tarhan with Orhan toward the stable and orchard where any concealed withdrawal would likely begin. Killil and the scouts to watch for cellar vents. No fire unless cornered. Shahin Shah alive above all. Mahmud if possible. Andronikos if God permitted. As the light bled from the sky and the first evening chill settled over the pines, the riders moved into place. The stream below St. Varan murmured over stones with the sound of distant prayer beads slipping through old fingers. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney. Somewhere inside the walls, a bell rope moved just once in the windless air, testing itself before use. Orhan Sahib flattened himself against the orchard wall and listened. He heard soft footsteps beyond, a horse shifting in the stable, the scrape of a bucket, a man coughing, wet, painful, likely wounded, Mahmud perhaps, or one of his guards. Then faintly from deeper within the compound another sound. A human voice. "Old horse angry." Shahin Shah. Esporcha's father still lived. Orhan closed his eyes for 1 heartbeat, then opened them again and gave the signal. Jarkata rose into the tower darkness like a piece of the night deciding to climb. Fatima's archers drew. Evrenos adjusted his grip. Barhan Faladios lowered his shoulder. Tarhan leaned toward the stable corner, every line of him ready to intercept whatever came fast and lethal from behind it. The empire held its breath beneath the trees. And in the monastery that was no monastery, Andronikos was praying. Not to God, not truly. Men like him had passed the point where prayer meant surrender and turned it into negotiation. He stood in the old chapter room with Shahin Shah bound to a carved chair, and Mahmud seated nearby while a physician tried to stitch the shoulder wound without earning a dagger for his trouble. The candles shook in the draught. The icons on the wall looked down with cracked, indifferent faces. Andronikos's hands were clasped behind his back. His armor was still dirty from the tunnel. His eyes had not softened since the Kanka. He listened to Shahin Shah's ragged breathing and said, "It is almost admirable, old man. How the Ottomans gather around symbols while pretending to gather around God. They burned fleets, broke armies, took fortresses, all while moving one spy through my chambers like a knife inside silk. Perhaps that is their true religion. Patience." Shahin Shah, though weak, still found enough contempt to lift his head. "No," he said, "their true religion is belief. Patience is only what belief looks like when your enemies call it cunning." Andronikos turned and stared at him. Then the first body hit the bell tower stones above. The sound was small, so small that an ordinary man might have missed it, but men under pursuit hear danger even in pebbles. Mahmud's eyes snapped upward. Andronikos's hand went instantly to his sword. Too late. The bell rope dropped from above, cut. Fatima's first arrow took the watch slit and buried itself in the throat behind it. Barhan Faladios and Evrenos hit the gate together like judgment and a landslide combined. The old wood burst inward. Monks, false monks, hidden guards, whoever waited there had time only for one look before the courtyard became war. And that is where the next storm begins, with the gate of St. Varan breaking under Ottoman hands, with Şahin Şah hearing rescue or another captivity rush toward him, with Mahmud stumbling to his feet, with Andronikos drawing steel in a sanctuary of lies, and with Orhan Sahib and Tarhan moving through the orchard shadows, toward the stable where escape always waits saddled before honor does. The war has not ended. It has only narrowed again, down to one false monastery, one hostage, one prince whose dreams have burned and who now fights like a man trying to survive the ruins of his own ambition. And the night, as always, is watching. As the sun climbed higher, painting the Marmara in shades of gold and blood, the Ottoman fleet turned back toward Bursa with heavy sails and heavier hearts. Orhan Sahib stood at the prow of the lead galley, one arm wrapped protectively around a sportia, whose wounded shoulder was freshly bound beneath her cloak. The arrow had been removed, but the pain lingered like a shadow in her eyes. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his presence even as he drew resolve from hers. "Every victory costs more than the last," she whispered. Orhan pressed his lips to her temple. "And every cost brings us closer to ending this forever. You will see Constantinople's gates open not as a prisoner, but as a conqueror's wife." Behind them the sea still burned. Black columns of smoke rose from the wrecks of Genoese and Byzantine ships, a funeral pyre for the latest crusade that had died before it could truly begin. Tarhan moved among the men on the decks, tending wounds and lifting spirits with his steady voice. Faladios stood at the stern of his own vessel, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much death, his blade still red at the edge. "They will not stop," he muttered. "Not until we make them." The fleet reached Bursa's harbor by late afternoon. The city greeted them with weary cheers and prayers of gratitude. Aladdin Sahib waited at the gates with Ganya beside him, the newborn wrapped safely in her arms. The moment Orhan dismounted, his brother embraced him fiercely. "You live, you both live. Allah is merciful." Ganya rushed to a sportia, helping her down with gentle hands. "Come inside, sister. The healers are waiting." Safia ran forward and threw her arms around a sportia, careful of the wound, tears streaming down her young face. "I was so afraid for you." A sportia stroked her sister's hair. "And I fought harder knowing you waited for me." That night in the grand hall of the palace, the family gathered around a low fire. The newborn slept peacefully between Ganya and Aladdin. Orhan sat with a sportia resting against his chest, her bandaged shoulder carefully supported. The captains joined them briefly, sharing bread and water, their faces etched with the exhaustion of endless war. "Andronikos marches with a great host," Tarhan reported quietly. "They move fast, avoiding the coast. They mean to strike Bursa while we are still licking our wounds." Faladios added, his voice dark, "Şahin Şah rides with them. They have called upon every remaining lord and mercenary. This time they bring ladders, towers, and the full wrath of their so-called holy war." Orhan stared into the flames for a long moment. "Then we give them a welcome they will never forget. We do not hide behind walls waiting for siege. We meet them in the open field before they can encircle us. Tarhan, you will command the left wing, Faladios the right. I will lead the center with my wife at my side." Asportia lifted her head. "I can fight." Orhan looked down at her with both love and concern. "You will ride beside me, but I will not let you bleed again for my sake." Your presence alone will inspire the men more than any sword." She smiled faintly. "Then I will be your banner." The following dawn broke with purpose. Bursa emptied its fighting men onto the plains beyond the city. Thousands marched under green banners, their voices rising in unified prayer. Orhan rode at their head, a sportia beside him on a steady mare, her wound bound tight beneath light armor. Behind them came the full strength of the house, veterans blooded in fire and betrayal, young warriors eager to prove their honor, and captains whose loyalty had been forged in the hottest flames. Aladdin remained in the city with a strong garrison, guarding the women, the child, and the heart of the realm. They met Andronikos's great host by midday on the wide plain known as the Field of Crimson Dust. The enemy stretched across the horizon like a dark sea, Byzantine heavy infantry, papal knights in shining plate, Genoese crossbowmen, and Shahanshah's personal guard flying imperial eagles. Andronikos himself rode forward under a flag of truce, Shahanshah at his side, their faces masks of hatred and desperation. "Surrender now, Orhan," Andronikos called across the field. "Give us the princess and the child. Swear fealty and we will spare your city." Shahanshah added coldly, "Refuse, and we will leave nothing but ashes and the memory of your failure." Orhan rode a few paces forward, a sportia at his right. His voice carried across the silent plain, strong and clear. "You speak of surrender while your hands are stained with the blood of innocents and traitors. You threaten my wife, my brother's son, my people. Today we end your tyranny. Today the Osmanli write their own destiny." He raised his sword high. "Allahu Akbar." The roar that answered him shook the earth. The two armies charged. The clash was cataclysmic. Dust rose in choking clouds. Steel screamed against steel. Tarhan led the left wing in a devastating sweep, his elite riders crashing into the Genoese flank like a thunderbolt. Arrows filled the sky as Faladios drove the right wing forward with unrelenting fury, his sword seeking out papal knights and cutting them down with righteous wrath. In the center, Orhan and Asportia fought side by side. Despite her injury, she wielded her blade with deadly precision, protecting her husband's blind side while he carved through the enemy like divine justice given form. At the heart of the melee, Orhan finally met Andronikos in single combat. Their horses collided. Swords rang like judgment bells. "You took everything from me," Andronikos screamed, swinging wildly. Orhan parried with masterful control. "You lost everything the day you chose betrayal over honor." Their duel was fierce and personal, blades flashing amid the chaos of smoke and dust. Andronikos landed a glancing blow across Orhan's arm, but Orhan answered with a powerful strike that shattered the Byzantine prince's shield and sent him reeling from his saddle. Shahanshah watched from the rear, his face pale with terror as his grand army began to fracture. He turned to flee, but Faladios cut off his escape, forcing the emperor into a desperate last stand. Their blades met in a whirlwind of steel and hatred. "Your empire dies today," Faladios roared. Shahanshah fought with the strength of a cornered animal, but Faladios was unrelenting. With a final, thunderous blow, he disarmed the emperor and held his sword to the man's throat. "Yield or die." As the enemy host began to rout, a great cry of victory rose from the Ottoman ranks. Yet in that moment of triumph, a hidden Byzantine archer, loyal to the end, loosed a final arrow from the dust. It flew straight toward Asportia. Orhan saw it too late. He threw himself forward, shielding her once more. The arrow struck him in the chest. He fell from his horse. The battlefield seemed to freeze as Sultan Orhan Sahib collapsed upon the crimson dust, blood spreading across his armor. Asportia screamed his name and dropped beside him, pressing her hands desperately over the wound. "Orhan, no, stay with me." Tarhan and Faladios fought their way to their fallen sultan, forming a protective circle as the last enemy forces scattered. Orhan looked up at Asportia, his hand reaching weakly for her face. "Live," he whispered, blood on his lips. "Raise our legacy strong, I love you." His eyes began to close as the chaos of battle slowly faded into an eerie silence. The sun stood high over the field of crimson dust. Victory had come at the highest possible price. Esportia held her wounded husband, tears streaming down her face, while the captains knelt around them. In the distance, the enemy banners lay broken and trampled. But whether Sultan Orhan Sahib would live to see the dawn of the new empire, he had bled for remained hanging in the hands of fate and the mercy of Allah. The war had reached its most terrible crossroads, and the long, cinematic story of blood, honor, and destiny was far from over. As the dust of the field of crimson dust began to settle beneath the indifferent sun, a terrible silence fell across the victorious yet grieving Ottoman ranks. Sultan Orhan Sahib lay upon the blood-soaked earth, the arrow buried deep in his chest, his breathing shallow and ragged. Esportia knelt over him, her own wounded shoulder forgotten, pressing both hands desperately against the wound as blood flowed between her fingers. "Orhan, my husband. Do not leave me," she whispered fiercely, tears cutting clean paths through the dirt and blood on her face. "You promised we would walk this path together. You cannot break that oath now." Tarhan dropped to one knee beside them, his elite sword planted in the ground like a guardian. "My Sultan, hold on. The battle is won. Do not let death claim victory after we have taken the field." Faladios arrived like a storm, scattering the last fleeing enemies before falling beside his lord. "We have broken their host. Shahin Shah flees like a dog. You must live to see it." The captains formed a tight circle of steel and loyalty around their fallen sultan, shields raised against any desperate counterattack, while healers rushed forward through the chaos. Orhan's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain yet burning with unyielding will. His hand rose weakly, finding Esportia's face. "My love," he breathed, blood touching his lips, "if this is my time, know that I leave this world with no regret, only gratitude for you, for our house." Esportia shook her head violently. "No, you will not speak of leaving. You will live. Our son needs his uncle. Safia needs her protector. I need my husband." She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "Fight, Orhan Sahib. Fight as you have always fought." They lifted him with infinite care onto a swift litter borne by the strongest warriors. The march back to Bursa became a race against death itself. Tarhan and Faladios rode on either side like twin avenging angels, clearing the path while the main force followed in solemn procession. Behind them, the broken banners of Byzantium and the papacy lay trampled into the crimson dust. Victory had come, but its taste was bitter upon every tongue. Inside the palace of Bursa, the news struck like lightning. Aladdin Sahib met them at the gates, face pale as death. Ganya stood beside him, clutching the newborn tightly, tears already flowing. Safia ran forward with a cry, small hands reaching toward her sister and the wounded sultan. They carried Orhan straight into the grand healing chamber, laying him upon the same bed where Esportia had fought her own pain only days before. The finest healers in the realm worked urgently, cutting away armor, extracting the arrow with skilled hands, cleaning the wound, and applying every herb and prayer known to man. Incense rose thickly. Quranic verses filled the air as voices rose in continuous supplication. Esportia refused to leave his side. She sat beside him through